Make yourself comfortable in the chair and just sitting forwards a little bit in your chair to get that on. Otherwise, I'll end up tripping over it instead. And we're not necessarily going to sort of hold this position forever. It's quite a strong position to be in, but just give yourself a few moments. We're just trying to remember really what it's like to be upright without having to strain in. It's something we get little glimpses of, I think, as we develop in Tai Chi. So you want to have your weight a little bit forward in your feet, and rather than having this idea that you've got to somehow hold yourself in position, just try and get a sense of being supported by the ground, by your feet, by the chair, of course, and therefore by your hips, buttocks, so that the weight of your upper body starts to sort of settle down. We sometimes refer to it as sitting into the hips. Relatively easy, I think, when you're sitting, because you've got the security of the chair. But if you can start to get that feeling of being upright without straining here, then you've got something to take into the standing posture. It is, however, quite strong because it's not effortless. You're being held, but you're being held by your body. So you are engaging parts of your body that are sometimes rarely used. So, for instance, you may find your back starts to ache. When it does, sit back, change your position, but try not to lean back. So if you do sit back, try initially just having the lower part of your back against the chair, so you've still got that slight angle forwards. If that doesn't work, do sit back and rest. But recognize that most chairs, excuse me, most chairs will mean that you sit back a little bit when you do. So you'll be leaning backwards, and that makes going forwards quite tricky. I'll come back to that in a moment. Just rubbing your hands together, and then tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. Down to one shoulder and your arm. On the other side. And upper part of your chest. Belly. And your legs. Put your feet forwards, and that will cause you just to sit back in the chair. That in itself shows you how significant your feet are. Trying to be upright in this position with both feet out really is quite difficult. So we drop back, and this is the posture that reminds us what it's like just to sit back in your favorite chair. In the first instance, we want to think about the points of contact with the chair. So that would be in the middle of your back, it depends on the chair, of course, and lower back, hips, buttocks, as the immediate points where we want to release, to allow a kind of passage downwards, like taking the plug out of a sink full of water. So those areas we want to bring that awareness of. I've talked about this before. You have a tightly clenched fist, it's really quite painful and stiff, and you just create a hollow fist. You've still got the structure of the fist, but a lot less in terms of feeling kind of blocked up in your arm. And it's that releasing feeling that we're looking for in those points of contact. And coming out of that, a change, well, wherever you feel it in your body, maybe feeling that your rib cage kind of opens out a little bit, maybe feeling the change in your breathing, whatever there is to observe. Many of those things we're going to want to try and reproduce in the upright stance. Again, it's quite tricky whether seated or standing. And again, just having a sense of what that means to release in the ribs, for instance, can help us to achieve that in other positions. Notice how your breath is inclined to settle and become a bit smoother. Just letting your attention rest in your body. So then without hurrying, draw your feet in and use that movement to help you come back to an upright position. And again, now it's feet, legs, hips, buttocks, lower back are the plugs, if you like. That's what we want to focus on first. And then get this feeling of our upper body beginning to almost sort of melt into the hips and into the center part of the body, that sense of a stronger area that would include the central skeleton, like the spine. But it's not just about that, but that's a good starting point. 30% of your weight, or a third of your weight, in your feet. And again, particularly with this seated stance and the fact that you're angling slightly forwards, see if you can feel, again, this sense of releasing in the front of your body, a sense of the front of your body, your ribs and all the internal organs, slightly hanging from the spine and your back. And then turning your head. So those are things that we want to come back to. They're things that we lose very easily. We often know you may stiffen up in your back or the shoulders just out of habit. And what we want to do is to introduce new habits. And in particular, just that sense of recognizing that we do lose this feeling in our postures and our movements regularly and frequently. And so when the movement doesn't feel right, and particularly with the more complex movements, our first response should always be, well, okay, what's happening in the feet, what's happening in the hips, is that correct? Before we try and correct anything else. And again, remembering that our arms are the most attractive thing to us, the most obvious thing to us. So it requires a deliberate effort in the first instance to make that switch of attention. And hands in front of your shoulders. It's actually one of the most important elements in Tai Chi. Perhaps see it a bit more clearly when we come to the standing. But it's very much one of those things that as you get used to it, you'll just quite naturally find that you're beginning to do outside of actually practicing Tai Chi. Going forwards. Remember that your posture is the vehicle for everything else, whatever you're interested in Tai Chi. Hands down to your sides and rotating your arms. Raising them up and winding them around. And back the other way. And back. rocking your weight forwards and backwards. The next thing we would look for in the exercises is how is the weight doing? And particularly the first set of exercises that we will be doing all involve make use of one way or another this transfer of the weight. That's the sort of fundamental driving mechanism. So again, if it's one of the more complex movements, so like part of the wild horse's mane, and you're struggling with the arms, take a break from that and just see if you can find, you know, things like the weight. And in a moment we'll get to the center of your body, hips and waist, and check those before you start to think in terms of, well, what do I do with my arm? And then just turn slightly. So when you turn in your hips, and when you do that, you carry on moving your weight, more of your weight will go into the leg that you turn to. So, you know, feet, legs, basic posture, transfer of the weight, turning in the center to give you direction. And as you get more experience of this, and you will go a good amount of experience of this, it's not just the physical direction, but we begin to focus our attention through the center of the body. And so it's like the imagery and the ideas that we bring into the movement kind of sit here in a sense. Turning the other way. So one of the reasons I start off with these exercises is really to draw the focus of your attention away from your arms. And then if we go forwards and turn, we feel the pelvis rocking slightly, we go back and we turn. And so that combination of movement, moving with good posture, transferring our weight, turning our center, all combine to move our shoulders, our head, our upper body through the circle. So not straining in your back, not straining in your shoulders. Change direction. One more time. And then the feet themselves, moving them, put your heel up, step forward, put your heel down, and then lower your toes, and make sure that contact with the ground is a good one. Don't overextend, because now I'm sort of sliding around on the floor and back. So just getting a measure for how far your legs and foot can extend out without straining. And that'll be shorter than our normal stepping. And then with your other foot. I sometimes say to people, rather than thinking this is a step, think of it as your leg extending and contracting. Just changing how we view the movement. And we do this a great deal in Tai Chi. If we change how we're thinking about the movement, then we have the potential to change how we're doing. Okay, and then coming back to the center. So these are all points that we want to sort of have in our minds as we go into the main set of exercises. Weight back in your hips, hands turning forward, and then bird fold it quick. This time from the forward position, changing into fisherman castanet. And rolling the ball in towards your chest. So what's happening in the back, the sides, subtle changes of expansion and contraction of the pathways of movement developing. And now pigeon spreads its wings. And change into pushing wave. One more time. Comes with birthday. And let's loose this. Follow, as though you're holding a feather in the palm of your hand. Just wrapping your fingers around, but not crushing. Turning your hands out, winding them out and back in. Now your chest opens, and then as you go forward, like the sternum eases back, and your upper back opens. Like the shoulder blades pull apart slightly. Remember, each time you open up an area of the body, just think in terms of the muscles for the moment. There's other things involved as well. Every time you sort of open up the muscles in your chest, the next thing they're going to do is contract. And as they contract, you go forward, and that opens up the muscles in your upper back, and then they contract. So we've got the basic movement of our weight going forwards and backwards as always. a key element in these exercises. But it doesn't mean that the movement and even the effort stopped in the upper part of the body. But none of this should be done in a strained way. And then polishing the table. So one of the advantages that we get from the regular pattern of the movements and the overall session, the overall sequence, is that I'm becoming more familiar with these movements. Just quite naturally, we end up being able to go beneath the surface of the management. We no longer have to simply follow the choreography. Don't lose track of that. And don't just assume that you can do it however long you've been doing these exercises. Every now and then, check what I'm doing in a particular movement. Ask yourself whether that is, in fact, what you're doing, or have you kind of drifted off a bit? Quite common doing that. One more time. Turn your hands palm up. Gentle expansion in the belly, pushing your hips and feet down, pushing up through the upper body, expanding, and then draining away. And changing to the wild goose. They soften your movements. And then parting the cloud. Slightly forward, then back into your hips with a push up. So when we view the movements from the outside, what we inevitably do is that when moving our arms, you can see the arms moving. Nothing wrong with that, as long as it's not the whole of the picture. So this time, at the end of the movement, go back to the first of them and do them as a little sequence. So rooting down, expanding, and contracting. Take your time as you change over to the wild goose. And then forward, sit back into your hips and parting the cloud. Just try and get a sense for how the movement within your body progresses. When we do the first one, just focus on that feeling of expansion in your belly, in your lower back. Now, at the start of the wild goose, we have the same thing, but the expansion moves up to the solar plexus and then drains away again. And then the part in the cloud's belly, solar plexus, and finally upper part of your chest into your arms. So that rather than feeling, particularly for that last one, that there's some kind of strain involved. Going back to the beginning now, we begin to appreciate that arms are moved in accordance with different patterns of expansion and contraction. You find all the way through the whole arm. So we train ourselves to become more aware of these smaller movements as the essential components of the bigger movements. Once again, as we want to change or we detect a blockage or something like that in the bigger movements, we can apply ourselves to very subtle aspects of change. Now, dragon plucks the stars from the sky, expanding in the same pattern, but obviously more on one side and then contracting. Expanding and there's a moment in between each stage where we give ourselves space just to come back to this basic position, remind ourselves that we're ideally wanting to maintain that all the way through the extending and contracting movement. Doing one more. And changing to both hands, same thing. So this is always going to be the order of the movement: feet, hips, belly, solar plexus, chest, and finally arms. And this is where much of the flow comes from. So that basic awareness that I was talking about, the different parts of the body, and just a very natural sense that as we become aware, if we can maintain a quiet awareness, those things that we're focusing on do tend to amplify and even coordinate a little better. And we can begin through that process of intent to alter the movement slightly and subtly to improve them and develop this overall sense of flow through the body. One more round. Extend one foot, scooping the sea and looking at the sky. So earlier I talked about leg expanding and contracting. Here, you may feel the same thing in your back and your spine as you go forward. Rather than thinking you've got to stretch your back or strain to get down there, when you get to here, tilt forward, let your head go forward. Just imagine your back expanding, your spine lengthening by having the cartilage pads, the spaces between the vertebrae, expand very, very slightly. And it's the sum total of that expansion that produces the bigger movement. That's a quite a crude example of what I'm talking about, but it does work quite well. Grasping the tiger's ears, your hips are sinking back, that same sense of lengthening through your spine. grasping the tiger's ear. Changing sides. Loosely fisted in your hands and fingers and grasping the tiger's ear. One more time. Bring the feet back. So part of the wild horse's mane. Stop your weight into your right foot. Move forwards into your left foot. So you take a diagonal line. The body turns to the left. Come back into your right. And you turn, and that brings the majority of your weight over to the left. I'm going to repeat that on once. Now go into your right hip, hold the ball, go forward. Look for that expansion in the side of your body and across the chest, which then, as you bring your weight back, there's again that natural contraction here. Hold the ball and move across. Turn, extending on the opposite side of your body so that as you go forward, it can contract and contribute to this drawing out of your arm. I'll do one more of these. And we're going to go into the movement, why tape offers fruit. And the initial change is actually very simple. In fact, what you're going to do is one thing less. You get to here and we feel the opening in the chest. I'll exaggerate. This is exaggerating, I think. And then we don't move the weight, but we let the chest close. Notice how that brings our hands closer together. Drop your left elbow down and you almost touch your elbow here. Fingers of the right hand pointing downwards. Now you move your weight, and it's like you're pulling your fingers out of mud. Turn your hand palm in to hold the ball. Turn slightly to look that way and push forward. Ward off and press. Coming back, turning, your right hand dropping down, coming in. Your left hip, part of wild horse's mane. Let your weight rest in your foot as your chest closes. Brings your hands together. Come back. And when you get here, just turn your hands in so they're holding the ball. And then come back onto the other side. Take your time, one movement at a time. It's very tempting to think, oh, I'm not going to do this, but that will lead you astray. This is why tape offers fruit, the seated version of why tape offers. So as you get more familiar with the choreography, the pattern, so once again, we start to notice all sorts of subtle things. So don't get too caught up on whether you can remember. Remember enough so that you can keep the repetition going. Memory builds over a period of time. And recognize that actually between one movement and another, each movement is very simple. It's when we confuse them that they become complicated. So here, for example, I go to here, I start to close the chest. And as my hand and my elbow come together, I turn this hand palm inwards. I point the fingers down. Now I can go back. I've got this movement. See how it's, instead it's like pulling my fingers out of mud. And I come over. I may even turn a bit as I do. Most of my weight now back in this hip. And then I turn towards my left hand, or your left hand will turn. And I'm holding the small ball here, and I take it forward. And then coming back. Start all over again. Do one more on each side. So a lot of the value in a set like this, it's not just about whether you can actually sort of like do fancy movements. Obviously, it's nice to be able to feel that you can do the movement. But in terms of how it trains our awareness, where is your weight? Where is your center point? What are the movements that move your arm outwards and then bring the other hand in and then draw you back? Where do you feel the patterns of movement, of contraction and expansion? And then just come back to rest in this position. Give yourself a few moments to remind yourself how it can feel when you don't have to sort of tighten up in your back or wherever else you're tightening. Take a couple of slow, gentle breaths. And then, once again, rubbing your hands together. Tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. Down to one shoulder and then your arm. On the other side. Up onto your chest. Your belly. Your legs. Pushing your heels up. And then over. And then back the other way. Good, and then stand. So think of it, Tai Chi as an exercise in problem solving. And if we see something like Part of the Wild Horse's Mane or White Ape Offers Fruit as the problem because it's quite complex, and our immediate response is always going to be, oh, that's really complex. But actually, we can look for the simple changes and we can gradually build them up. As I've said before, a wall is built brick by brick. So it offers an approach to dealing with things that is quite different. You know, there's a kind of psychology to this as well. One of the most important changes, perhaps the most important really in many ways, is the change that I pointed out first of all, from feeling that you're having to hold yourself tight, to hold yourself up constantly, to actually the recognition that you can find a way of actually being held. It's difficult though, it's not complicated, but it is difficult, and don't underestimate how that difficulty can kind of begin to block what you're doing. And that's why I often recommend to people, you know, standing next to a wall, side on or back on, because there will be trial and error, and quite reasonably we are not particularly comfortable with the idea that we're about to fall over. Who does want to fall over? Nobody in their right mind would want to just fall over. And so there's that little bit of sort of fear that causes a kind of stiffening. What we want to do is to gradually become more confident in this other way of standing, this other way of actually being upright. And the change is very, very simple. If I come a bit closer, I'll exaggerate, but it's from this to this. Just to, and as I drop down in my hips. My legs are supporting me. I can feel that strength, that stronger feeling within the body, and I've lost most of the tightness and the stiffness. From the side, again, I come a bit closer so you can see what's happening. I do it slower this time. Hold on, get the posture right. From here, it's simply, if you watch my hips, my hand that way. It's just this. All well and good. But if my weight's back in my heels when I do that, I go, oh, I just need to drop my hips, and I've gone down. I need to position my weight correctly. I need this sense of equilibrium in my posture. And the other thing that I need to do is, again, come closer and exaggerate. If I deliberately stiffen up my back and pull my belly in, I think, oh, okay, all I've got to do is drop my hip and I fall over again. Because the thing that stops me from being pulled backwards is, it's very subtle, so I'll exaggerate. As I do this, you can see my hips are going back, but what will happen is my pelvis tucks under. Don't try and do that. It's a very small movement and a very subtle movement, and you'll inevitably do it too much. But make sure that you're not working in an environment that requires you to do that. Don't pull your belly in. Try and release in your back, because both those areas, if they're tight, will lock the pelvis in position. Don't hold your knees tight. That will hold the pelvis in position. So cultivate an environment where this can begin to happen. Feel where your weight should sit, ideally just behind the ball of each foot. So, you know, if you wanted to do, I don't know, yeah, dragonfly skimmers the water. And big complicated. You go, oh, I can't, I'm falling all over the place. My question to you would be, how often have you practiced this? Hardly anything at all. But that's one of the that's one of the foundation bricks of the wall. And there's no point trying to add other things to it too quickly if you haven't begun to work on that. So now sinking down, and again, do these first three movements as a little sequence, feeling the expansion and contraction in your body and your sides, gradually building up, like watching the sea come in and seeing, you know, the waves gradually creep up the beach. And if you don't quite feel it like that, if you feel it slightly differently, that needn't be a problem, because what you're doing is you're learning to observe these things. And as you begin to observe them, you can begin to make use of them. we can follow up that observation, that awareness, that attention with our intent. The intent is the way that our minds give instructions to our body. But we need the feedback from our body to focus our intent. So, as I've said before, not mind over matter. We're not forcing our body to do something against its will, as it were. And that's why I like the term cultivation. You don't force a plant to grow. You create an environment within which it actually grows. You're not trying to dominate the plant. And just notice where you get a response to that idea and where you don't. It doesn't mean that because there are areas that aren't responding immediately that you're doing it wrong somehow. It takes time to develop this. It's a very subtle aspect of the art, I feel. One more round. Good. And then just shake out. So this is not a foolproof method, and I'm not trying to suggest that all you're going to do is think right. These three aspects of Tai Chi, of the body, the mind, and the movement, or the energy, interact with each other and support each other. If you've got an arthritic knee, I'm not suggesting that if you just think the right thoughts, it'll go away. It's not going to. What you can do is perhaps work more creatively, more gently with it, with this change of perspective that comes with Tai Chi. Now, have one foot forward and begin to transfer your weight again. Again, here, I sink down, I get that feeling of compression in my leg, and then it expands. And that's when I go forward. So I sometimes talk about pushing yourself forwards and backwards. This is a slightly more subtle element that actually the thing that will generate the forward or backward movement is actually the sinking down each time. Imagine being on a trampoline and a bouncy castle and just standing there and thinking, not a very good trampoline, I'm not going anywhere. You have to go down first and then it will push you up. So allowing yourself to sink, or more importantly, perhaps, allowing yourself to release. It's not necessarily that your knee is bending more, but releasing more. So that brings us back to this awareness of the clenched fist, the more open fist, the feeling in the body when that begins to happen. Feeling of your hips dropping back serves to stabilize you. So when you start to introduce the stepping again, you raise your toes and your heel, and accompanied with that, and this is a habit that we want to build. There is no up without a down. So you can't raise your heel unless something else goes down. It's like a seesaw. And the bit that should go down, the bit that's really good to focus on to go down, is that feeling in your hips. Because that's one of the key areas that we want to try and get that feeling of gravity pulling us down. And then stepping in. Difficult? Yes, very difficult. Quick? No. 40 years of doing Tai Chi, and I'm still working on these things that I'm talking to you about. I'm not claiming that I've got these things perfect by any means. It's part of the ongoing, I have to say, quite fascinating process of practicing Tai Chi. Your other foot forwards. So rather than thinking of this as sort of like a lesson to learn, think of this as the start of an awareness and a process. That, you know, these are the things that I've been talking about today. That when I go out and practice in the morning, that I'm really practicing for, and that I'm certainly having, that I certainly need in place before I think of doing anything else. Raising toes and heels. Drawing your feet in and pushing them out. Oops. I didn't do that deliberately, but there was a little wobble there and I dropped down. So these are the things that you will find yourself beginning to do in your daily life. They're difficult but not complicated. And then stepping through. They require practice. So when I practice in the morning, one of the reasons I do that is to remind myself of all these things, because overnight I've forgotten. And then going back. So do something at the start of the day to remind yourself, oh, there are times when I don't have to struggle to remain upright. It won't be all the time. But just remind yourself of that possibility. So just watch this transition. We're going to do a few fisherman cast the net. When I get to this position, I can feel various parts of my body have expanded and so on and so forth, the things that I've been talking about. And then if I go from here and I turn my body, I'm in Wind Blows the Willows. I haven't had to do anything else. So we see this and we go, oh yeah, that's nice. Oh, what are you doing now? It's all up there. But actually, I talked about problem solving. I just soften in my front hip and I'll call this Wind Blows the Willows, shall I? Because it's a nice exercise. And there's things that we add on to that, but that's how it starts. So looking for that small change that leads to a bigger change. So fishermen casting, they're paying particular attention to that feeling just at the end of the forward movement here. We could do it with the backward movement, but I think it's more accessible with the forward movement. So then you go forwards and you turn. And suddenly we have Wind Blows the Willows. We haven't had to strain or do anything particularly complicated. It's just an extension of the previous exercise. So we can still have a sense of, for instance, our hips hanging downwards. We've still got that stability. So know how far we can move, maintain quality of movement in our body. And yes, we can begin to sort of then think about, can I do something different with the arms? Can I make the movement better by spreading my fingers out or something like that? There's all sorts of things that we can do, but it's just understanding where they come in the order of things. And shake out. Have your left foot forwards, fisherman cast the net. Just a few rounds, just a familiar exercise. Really good one. I'm facing forwards, I'm moving forwards and backwards. My arms are moving forwards and backwards. So if I go forwards, but I face to the side, my arms will change. The wind blows the willow. I can build, remember the wild goose, we felt the expansion going up into the solar plexus, and later we went into part the clouds up into the upper part of the chest. If we can bring our intent to do that again, to feel that expansion and contraction, that will start to move our arms more, and so on and so forth. There's many ways that this develops, but it has to be done on the basis of that simple change. Then turn my front foot out, and then going into dragonfly skin of the water, hips dropping back, remember. So you may or may not choose to lift your foot up. But before you lift your foot up, if you choose to do so, you have to drop your hips back. To get an up, there has to be a down. And so we instill in ourselves this way of moving, this approach to movement. It's quite different to how we would often think about doing things. And then bringing your feet parallel. Okay. Go back to your chair. The starting point for this class and for everything that we've done in this class was just simply sitting, coming to an upright position without straining. And again, you know, we can practice this simply, so that it's not complicated. We can just remind ourselves of this every day. And you know, that, again, that's one of the great things about the morning practice. You switch attention, if like, you switch modes. So letting your hips sink into the chair, feeling the push back up, belly, solar plexus, chest, bringing your arms around and in, and then that sinking down. This is the feeling that I'm trying to get across to you. Embrace tiger, return to them. Hips sinking, shoulders dropping, rib cage dropping. And just lovely. Thank you very much, everybody. So remember, no class this Tuesday, or this coming Tuesday. It's 22nd, but we're back here next Thursday.